thereby rendering him no assistance, and his fate was inevitable. At last accounts, his body was not found. This sad accident should teach the parties whose duty it is to look into these things the great importance of having bridges perfectly secure. Human lives are at stake and are hazarded every time a person crosses one which is not secure. I read you that because it took another 15 years to get a secure bridge, but those words were taken to heart. This was a big enough loss in the community for them to really start to consider the fact that they needed to have a good bridge in Euharlee. We can assume a lot of things, the lag between this event in 1871 and the actual construction of the bridge in 1886. This lag was due to several factors, including the economic instability that was experienced during Reconstruction. There was another just unstable bridge that was put in its place temporarily, but of course it was washed away. So that brings us to the King family. How many of you have heard of Horace King family before, the bridge building family? We got a few? Okay, great. I'm glad to teach you about them. I think this family it definitely impacted Euharlee, but throughout the Southeast, this is an incredible story, and I love to be able to share it. So right here we have Horace King in the middle and his 4 adult sons. I'm going to be focusing on Washington, who's on the top left, and I'm going to tell you also about Horace, but all of his brothers, all of his sons, all of Washington's brothers were part of this bridge building business, and I encourage you to learn more about them if you ever get the opportunity. But I'm going to talk about Horace first. For a long time, we actually thought Horace King built the Euharlee Bridge. Like I said, this bridge was built in 1886, and having a Horace King bridge is something that every community really wanted to have. If you have a covered bridge, you wanted it to be a Horace King bridge because he was so famous and so prolific. However, Horace King died in 1885, so he could not have built our bridge in 1886. There was a discrepancy on his actual date of death. They knew it was May 28th, but for a long time, some people said it was 1885, some said it was 1886, but we now know that he did not build our bridge and in fact had passed away. Despite this, he's still very important to our story as he gave birth, he was the father of, his wife gave birth to Washington King. That would be a miraculous story. He gave birth to Washington King, who did build our bridge. Horace King was born in 1807 in South Carolina, and he was born into slavery. He was of African, European, and Native American descent. And like I said, he was a highly esteemed, prolific bridge builder in the South, both antebellum and postbellum. In the early 1830s, he was purchased from the King family by a man named John Godwin. John Godwin was a builder, and they may have actually met in South Carolina on a project, learning from Effield Town, who developed this style of bridge that we have in Euharlee. It wasn't until the 1830s that he was purchased by John Godwin, but within a short time, Horace King was building bridges, was showing his incredible talent despite not being formally educated in any type of architecture, and basically began taking on contractor jobs as an enslaved person. We will see eventually he obtains his freedom, and I'll get into that in just a minute to give you the details of how he obtained his freedom in 1846. But he married a woman named Frances Gould Thomas in 1839. She was a free woman of color from Macon, Georgia, actually. Her mother, Rachel, was freed in her lifetime, and so before Frances was born, and so when Frances was born, she was a free woman of color. The fact that Horace was able to marry Frances Thomas speaks to the unique relationship, the atypical relationship that John Godwin and Horace King had. Because all of their children were born free. And the fact that his slaveholder allowed him to marry whom he wanted and have children that were born free meant that he was valuable enough and their relationship was close enough that he could do that, and he was permitted to live in their own home and had really atypical privileges that a lot of enslaved people did not have. Horace and Frances had 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. There aren't a lot of pictures of the daughter, unfortunately, so I did not include one today. Her name was Annie Elizabeth, and I thought it was important that she also be shared with all of you. In the 1840s, Godwin's wealth started declining, so they actually gave Horace to his daughter Anne, and then ended up emancipating him, because they were fearful that should he go into bankruptcy, should his possessions be taken, that Horace would be given to a different slaveholder. An act of the Alabama legislature was actually required to emancipate Horace and allow him to remain in the state of Alabama. The laws at that time said emancipated slaves were required to leave the state within a year because they didn't want to have a lot of free people of color, former slaves, around, maybe instigating and getting other slaves to try to win their freedom. So he stayed in Alabama, he stayed with the Godwin family, and in fact he paid for, after John Godwin died, he paid for his gravestone, Horace did, he paid for his family, his descendants, and made sure they were taken care of for the rest of their lives. So again, this is a unique relationship that you don't often see between slaveholder and enslaved person. Anyways, so he was emancipated before the Civil War. His children, like I said, were all born free, and he continued to expand his business and was even contracted with the Confederate Army to do different projects during the Civil War. After the war, like I said, he continued to expand his business, ends up in LaGrange, Georgia, after serving in the Alabama legislature during the Reconstruction period. His sons all joined his business. So we have Washington, Marshall, George, and John. They all joined the business. Washington decides, as his father is starting to grow older, and as he pulls back from the business, Washington decides to go out on his own. So Washington King moves to Atlanta and starts his own construction company. However, he continues to work with his brothers on different projects and still remains close with the family. This is an example. His brothers focus more on West Georgia, a Horace King Bridge. This is the Big Red Creek Covered Bridge, built in the 1840s. It crosses the Red Oak Creek in Meriwether County. It's actually not entirely a covered bridge. 252 of the 391 feet are covered. It is a town lattice style, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in just a minute. And it's also known as the Imlek Bridge. This is considered the oldest covered bridge in Georgia. I have to correct some of my people in Euharlee because for a long time they said that ours was the oldest covered bridge. I wish it was. It is not. But all of them are old at this point. So that brings me to Washington. Washington, like I said, he branched out on his own. He had been entrepreneurial for a long time. When he was a young man, he actually ran pole boats up and down Chattahoochee and across the Chattahoochee in Alabama, between the Alabama-Georgia border, up until the Civil War. So it's not a surprise that he was the one to kind of break off and start his own business in Atlanta. He married a woman named Georgia Swift in 1881, and they had 2 children, Ernest and Annadelle. And while in Atlanta, they resided on Chestnut Street, and then later they lived on Euharlee Street, which I find interesting that he lived on Euharlee Street in Atlanta. I don't know what the connection is. I haven't delved that far into it, but it would be an interesting coincidence nonetheless. Georgia was an alumna of Atlanta University, graduated in the class of 1874, and they encouraged their children to go on and pursue higher education. Their daughter Annadelle taught classical languages at Atlanta University, and Ernest followed in his father's footsteps and became what they now call a civil engineer. I'll show you a picture later on, but in one instance, he was carrying on the King legacy. There's a bridge called the Fort Gaines Bridge that Horace built in 1868, and Washington repaired in 1888, and then Ernest repairs in 1913 before it's washed away and replaced with the steel bridge in 1926. So it's interesting to see how they all have this talent and were able to continue it on for generations. So I'm going to show you two other Washington King bridges before we finally get to our Euharlee Bridge. This is the Watson Mill Bridge in the Watson Mill State Park. It was built in 1885, 1 year prior to ours. It spans the South Fork River. It spans 229 feet. That's in Madison County, Georgia. And then we have, many of you may have seen this one, the Stone Mountain Bridge. It was not originally in Stone Mountain. It was built in 1891 in Clark County, right outside of Athens. And they sold it to Stone Mountain for like $1 in 1965 because they just wanted it to be gone. They needed it to be moved. Unfortunately, they didn't tear it down. They moved it to Stone Mountain Park. And that spans 151 feet, so it's a little bit larger than ours. So, tells you a little bit about Washington, a little bit about Horace, and now I'm going to tell you about our bridge. Our bridge was built in 1886. In 1880, a man from Polk County named Daniel Lowry moved to Euharlee and purchased the Euharlee Grist Mill, formerly called the Tumlin Mill that I spoke about with Elihu Nelson. And he purchased the surrounding land, eventually owning thousands of acres in Euharlee all the way to Polk County. Not long after he purchased the mill, it caught fire again. Several times our mill has unfortunately been set on fire. And as he's rebuilding his mill, Daniel Lowry starts to push for a bridge to be built, a better bridge, a good bridge, to be built right next to his mill. That's an economic advantage for him. Customers needed a way to get to him, and he's driving people right into his business. So he ends up providing the stone, the limestone for the piers under our bridge, and really courting and lobbying our commissioners, the road commissioners, to put the bridge there. So in 1886, there's a notice in our local papers where they announced that they are going to be advertising for a contractor to build a bridge going over Euharlee Creek near the mills. It's funny because it says the said bridge will be about 300 feet long, and I don't know what they're talking about. Our bridge is 138 feet long. I'm not sure how they were measuring or what they were measuring or where they were measuring, but of course it ends up being less than half of that. They were closing bids on September 7th, and at the same time, they were also accepting bids to repair and repaint a bridge at Howard Shoals on the Etowah. Washington King and his brother George built that covered bridge in the Allatoona area of Bartow County. So that bridge is no longer standing, but there was already one Washington King bridge in Bartow County. And so the county was familiar with him, and we think that's probably why he was chosen to construct this bridge. Washington King and another man were contracted to build this bridge for $1,300. That's all they were paid to construct this bridge. I unfortunately haven't been able to find any records of Washington Kings because I want to see how much of that, how much the materials cost, what all the figures that go into that, to see how much profit they actually made out of it. But $1,300 does not sound like a lot in today's money, for sure. His partner in this was a man named Jonathan Burke. We don't have a lot of information about Jonathan Burke, but I think I found him, and I'll tell you what I know. But other historians have suggested that it was prudent or even necessary for King to partner with a white contractor on various projects. His father, for example, when working on Howard's Bridge in Oglethorpe County, partnered with a man named J.M. Pink Hunt. Of course, while Horace was enslaved, he also relied on John Godwin to help him secure some of his contracts. But this was not always the case. Like I said, with the Howard Shoals Bridge in Bartow County, he partnered with his brother George. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly why he needed to partner with a white contractor versus partnering with one of his brothers. So I've searched a lot of local records, census records, and I think I found Jonathan H. Burke, man born in Tennessee, married a local Cartersville girl named Alice Barnett in 1884. In the 1900 census, he was listed as a carpenter, living primarily in the Allatoona area. That perhaps could be where Jonathan Burke and Washington King met.